Do you have a true scary story you would like to submit? Just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. Hey there. I've been a long-time listener, and I had a story that I wanted to share with you that, unfortunately, happened to me. I used to work at a liquor store for a little over a year. I actually quit after this event occurred. I'm a single and first-time mother. My baby is almost 10 months old, so, needless to say, she pretty much never leaves my sight. Sometimes my mom would visit and help me take care of her or watch her while I slept at my place, but it's not very often as she lives about an hour away. And that's more so when she just comes to visit on the weekends. I'm in my early 30s and had been with the same guy for the last 7 or 8 years until he learned that I was pregnant. Then he claimed that he never loved me and he was just there for the ride, etc., etc. So he moved out of the apartment that we shared, leaving me to pay the rent alone, which I couldn't afford. After a nightmare of a move and more debts to deal with, I moved out too, and at least found a place that I could afford on my income. Before all of this chaos, I had a steady job at a staffing firm, irony, and they laid a lot of people off, which left me desperate to find anything that would pay me. And that's how I ended up working at the liquor store. To my surprise, they treated us better than I expected. They even had benefit options and were flexible and willing to work with all of us when it came to our schedules. This was a huge relief for me because I didn't have someone that lived close by to watch my daughter, nor could I afford to pay for a babysitter or daycare. So, I told the owners, which was an older couple, about having such a young child, and their wife, Darla, was smitten when she saw her the first time. She told me that I was more than welcome to bring her with me, since it's not like she was going to be running down the aisles potentially breaking things. This was such a huge stress lifted from me, knowing that I could work and still keep my eye on my daughter. I usually stayed behind the counter at the register, and she stayed in her car seat. Darla actually brought in a small bassinet that she had bought specifically for me, and she kept it in the back room. When I worked, I would bring it out and set it up, which gave her a bit more wiggle room. They really did treat me like family. The pay was decent too, so I knew I would eventually need to find a job where I made more, but for the moment, I was feeling happy again, and felt like I belonged, so I was definitely getting comfortable with the job. Anyways, sorry for the ramblings. I didn't really have a set shift and would work days or nights, basically wherever they needed me. This happened when I was working the closing shift, which was from about 5 to 11, but more typically until midnight after all the closing work was done. It usually wasn't too busy being a smaller store, so it wasn't unusual to be alone on the night shift, which I was okay with too. We had a few of our regulars come in as normal, but then after 9 or 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, it was pretty dead. I would turn on the TV that was behind the register or just watch something or play a game on my phone. The owners were okay with this, as long as when a customer came in, we were paying attention to them. Maybe not watching them like a hawk, but checking the above mirrors to make sure they're not stealing anything, and making sure you're giving them your attention. It made sense to me. So, on this night, I had my daughter in the bassinet, and she was sleeping. I was playing Sudoku on my phone when the doorbell chimed, and a guy walked in. I greeted him, and when all he did was look at me and quickly look away, I immediately took a mental note of what he looked like. Whether they're rude or suspicious, those people tend to stand out. Unfortunately, he was kind of hitting both labels. He was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. It had been raining though, so I could see the hood was a little wet, and I assumed that maybe that's why it was up. He had a bit of a beard growing that stuck out from the hoodie, but not much. And after opening the door, his hand remained in his front pocket when he walked around. This is when I started feeling a little uneasy about this guy. I would glance up at the mirrors and would see him constantly looking up at it too, and he would quickly look back down when our eyes would meet. I started watching his movements closer, and I noticed that he was looking around the store. Not like he was trying to find something, but more so casing the place. This started to worry me. We weren't in a bad or shady part of the city, and, in fact, the store was part of a strip mall of stores, which actually had a small open bar at the end. So, even though I was alone in the store, I was definitely not alone in the middle of nowhere. While doing my best to not let him notice my nervousness, I slowly dialed 911 on my phone and just let it sit there without hitting the call button, and then slid it back under the counter. After he walked up and down every aisle, he came back towards the front while also looking down the back where the office was. He then approached the register, empty-handed mind you, and turned his attention to the small shooter bottles that we kept up front on the counter. He grabbed a few and laid them in front of me. I asked him if he had found everything that he was looking for. While looking down, he said, "Kind of." He then looked up, making direct eye contact, and then asked, "Are you here alone?" I at least wasn't stupid enough to tell him the truth, so, trying to sound as intimidating as possible, I told him no, and that the boss was in the back and asked if he wanted me to get them. He gave me a sinister smirk, declining my offer, and tossed a few bills at me. After giving him his change, he grabbed the bottles and put them in his pocket, which is when I noticed there was already something in his pocket. Something long. I wanted to scream right there, but to my surprise, he just left. I watched as he walked around the corner, and when he was out of view, I quickly went to lock the door. At this point, I was pretty freaked out, and reasonably so. I called Darla to tell her what I just witnessed and let her know that I wasn't feeling comfortable with being alone. Thankfully, she agreed, and understood, and she said that she would have her husband James come down there. She also told me to keep the door locked and just let the customers in as they appear. This is what I meant by they were always very considerate, instead of just telling me to buck up. As far as I was aware, they had never been robbed, so it was a pretty scary situation all around. Made worse, in my opinion, because I had my little girl with me. So I waited anxiously for James to arrive, and just kind of paced to the front, watching my daughter as she seemed to be the only thing to calm me down. Unfortunately, this would come to an abrupt halt when I heard someone trying to open the door. When I looked over at the door, my heart dropped, seeing the same guy. Except, this time, I must have ruined his plans when he noticed the door was locked. I saw his face immediately turn to one of anger and aggression, and we then made eye contact. I froze, not knowing what to do as my phone was on the counter, which was closer to the door. The door and the two walls were just glass, so what was stopping him from trying to break it, or worse yet, how well would the glass hold with his banging and yanking on the door? Because that's exactly what he started doing. He began yanking on the door harder and pounding on the glass, while yelling at me to let him in. I just kept telling him no and yelling at him to leave, but he wouldn't let up. My daughter was now awake and crying, and this guy was yelling. I then noticed that his right hand, which he was using to bang on the door, was holding something. And when he would lower his arm to yell at me, I could finally tell that it was a large knife. I was in full panic mode at this point. I went to grab my daughter, ready to run to the back, when the glass finally broke. Thank God they had an alarm system that went off when there was glass breaking. So, with my daughter in my arms, I ran to the back and locked myself in the bathroom, hoping he wouldn't try to go back there. Unfortunately, as I sat there, I realized I didn't have my phone on me, so all I could do was wait until someone came to help. It felt like an eternity, trying to calm my daughter while also trying to keep myself calm, when I started hearing somebody calling out for me. They identified themselves as an officer and said that I was safe, so I opened the door. I saw two men standing by the door in uniform, and they asked me if I was okay, and then led me out to where James and Darla and a few other random people were. They hugged me, asked if I was alright, and also apologized that I had to go through that. We then all talked to the cops about what I saw, and thankfully, they at least had security cameras that recorded and saved every 24 hours. So, we were able to provide that to the authorities. The guy also didn't get very far, as some people that were leaving the nearby bar could hear this guy yelling and banging, and one of them, in their drunken bravery, chased him down. I had to identify him, and man, I never thought that IDing someone would be so unnerving, especially when they gave me that same smirk when pointing them out. Needless to say, I was pretty shaken up by this, and I told James and Darla that I didn't think I could do it anymore. They were disappointed to see me go, but also understood. I've been out of work for a little over a month, and I'm incredibly thankful that my mom has been able to help me with rent and groceries for this past month. Darla actually called me last week and said that they were putting in reinforced glass and a much better door because of this, which was good to hear. But she also asked if I would be willing to come back if I was only working on days. I'm still mulling it over, as it was a pretty decent paying job, but that night keeps replaying in my head. Anyways, thank you for listening. Back around 2006, I worked as a contracted security guard. I worked at a lot of different places, such as hotels, hospitals, tech and banking buildings, you name it. The job was always the same, with minimal rules varying depending on the business. I have plenty of stories of weirdos trying to get past me, vindictive ex-workers, and more that I'll consider sharing in the future, but the ones that freaked me out the most were the ones that I have no explanation for. I'm by no means a small guy, and just standing within inches of someone was typically enough to get them to back off, but I will nope right the hell out of a haunted house. So, when my next contract was in a closed hotel, I was less than thrilled about the idea, but I bucked up and told myself that I could make it through the month and a half that I would be there. The hotel was empty because it had been shut down and the owners went bankrupt. The people, or debtors, I guess, had rights to the property, the furniture, and whatever else was in the building, so they hired security guards to monitor it until they were able to retrieve everything they wanted. I worked some of the day shifts when they needed someone to cover them, but usually just worked the overnight ones. And there was always a shift partner, and we were never alone, so that definitely helped a lot to keep my mind busy, so that I didn't dwell on the creepiness around me. If you've ever been in a large empty or abandoned building, you may know what I mean. The eerie silence is intense. And when you look around and see the building is in good condition and looks like you should see people coming out of the pool area, sounds of doors opening, people walking, and you just see none of this, it kind of puts you in a situation where you feel like you should be on guard. Sorry, it's kind of hard to explain. Definitely like something bad is happening that you aren't aware of or will happen. It's just an unsettling feeling. Anyways, it was probably about 2 a.m. or so, and my shift partner Trent and I were talking about food when we became really hungry. We didn't really have a lot of places nearby that delivered, so he offered to go grab something for us. This is where my stomach was louder than my brain. I thought I could totally handle being alone for a short amount of time until he got back, so I agreed and he left. So I was sitting there at the front desk, just waiting for time to pass. I played some stock games that was on my phone given to us by work, and then pulled out the small rubber ball I had found earlier that was in my pocket. I started bouncing it off the floor to the wall and would catch it, and just repeat this over and over. Until one of these cycles it was disrupted. The ball was coming back to me when it just seemed to fall to the ground. It was almost as if someone had blocked it from coming back to me, causing it to just stop. It was definitely weird, but I just chalked it up to losing momentum. Maybe I didn't throw it very hard, I don't know. So I went to pick up the ball when I started hearing a thumping noise. It made me stand up straight, stiff as a board when I heard it. Then I noticed that the thumping was in the same pattern that I was causing with throwing the ball. Thump to the floor, thump to the wall, thump after catching it. I stood there listening to this on repeat for several cycles. I first thought that someone must be in here and maybe they're doing something else and it just conveniently sounded the same, or that someone was messing with me. So I decided to check the floor above me, where it sounded like it was coming from. I took the stairs and started looking over the floor. I didn't immediately see anyone, so I continued looking down the halls, checking to see if any of the doors were open. We were given a master key that opened any and all of the doors of the hotel, including all of the rooms. But from what I could see, there were no open doors. Then I heard what sounded like a door opening or closing. I turned to look towards the hall where I thought it was coming from and made my way in that direction. This is where I started feeling anxious. Something was not right, and I didn't know what it was. But not seeing the cause of the sound immediately was starting to make me panic. With my hand on my taser, I shouted out, "This premise is closed to the public. You should leave now or you will be prosecuted by the owners." I was hoping that I sounded burly and threatening and didn't let my fears show through, but I was even more so hoping that whoever it was would just leave. However, it wouldn't be that easy. As I stood there and started to make my way down the hall, I heard what sounded like feet stomping or running, but I was still not seeing anything. The stomping continued to get louder and faster like it was coming towards me, and I froze, not knowing what to do. Then, suddenly, I felt a strong shift in the air and it got really cold. This is where my fight or flight finally kicked in, but I wasn't about to fight something that I couldn't see, so I darted back downstairs to the first floor and out the front door. I refused to go back in that building alone. I called Trent to see where he was at, and he said he was pretty close by, so after I hung up, I took a minute to pull myself together and went back in. But I turned all of the lights on the bottom floor. We usually just had the light on at the desk in the lobby, but I wanted to be able to see all around me at this point. When Trent got back, I told him that I thought I heard sounds upstairs but didn't find anything, and played it off as possibly hearing things or just echoes. So he brushed it off too. We didn't have any more experiences that night. I had to work there the next night but had a different shift partner, and he seemed nervous from the start. I'm not one to make fun of people's fears, but I did ask him what was up. He then explained how that place gave him a really weird, off feeling that he just couldn't shake. I asked him to explain more, and he told me his past experience, which was similar to mine. He even mentioned the stomping and running noises that he'd heard. so I probably shocked him when I started rambling about my paranoia of this place too, but he agreed with me. We both joked about how under no circumstances would we go to the second floor, and we definitely weren't going anywhere alone. After talking to some other guys that worked there, one of them mentioned how he was friends with one of the previous owners, and they told him that he felt the place was haunted, as they'd experienced the same thing. I was mentally freaking out. I was glad to know that I wasn't just being a coward, and that others were experiencing this too. But then, I also had to acknowledge that this, whatever it was, existed. I did work through it, but I tried to swap shifts as much as I could because I don't do ghosts. Thankfully, I never had another experience, but I also avoided any situation that may have given me one. Oh, and they've since leveled the place, so good riddance. Back in my early 20s, I used to work for a large tech company that made and repaired a lot of large, expensive equipment. Most of it was medical related, but there were a few other cleaning and sanitizing things they did as well. Now, with that type of equipment, came a lot of pretty important partners and stacks upon stacks of confidential information. Of course, you can't really hide those kinds of machines easily, so that meant that the building I worked in was huge. Not to mention the entrances in every room or office had restricted access. Everyone had a badge, and your badge would only let you into the rooms and areas you were supposed to be in. When I started, I got lost once, and I learned my lesson. People gave you weird looks if they didn't recognize you, so I caught on pretty quickly. I was hired to do data entry, but pretty quickly they had me doing other tasks, including filing, and I even found myself helping with a lot of tech support questions. I would say that a majority of the people that worked there were older, so there was always an issue with someone's system and they could never quite understand how to access the task manager. But I did genuinely enjoy it. Other than them always thinking I was a genius with tech, everyone was kind and inclusive and never demanding, which honestly was not what I expected when I started there. Anyways, that was just to give a little background as to where I worked. And that was where this story took place. I usually worked the normal Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. shift with occasional late nights when I wanted to get ahead, or if I was behind. At this point, my wife was out of town visiting her mom, so I decided I would get in some extra work to get ahead of things. There was a new partner coming in, and from what I've experienced, it was going to get crazy. So if I was going to be alone that night anyways, I thought I might as well get some more work done so I could be ahead. By 5 p.m., I started walking out and most people were already gone by then as well. I went home, had dinner, took a shower, and then I went straight back to the office. By the time I got back, it was already dark and the parking lot was nearly empty. I buzzed myself in through 2 sets of entry doors, and then used my card again in the elevator to get to the 4th floor. It was pretty dark in the building with some of the main area lights being motion activated. So, as I walked away from the elevator and down the hall towards the east side of the building, where my office was, the lights were beginning to kick on as I passed them. Saying I got a bit of a scare when I saw some guy standing by the stairs would be an understatement. I let out a small yelp and expletives, but then, trying to be a grown man, I laughed and just said something like, "Hey man." And the response that I got back was, "Sorry." But he didn't look up from his phone. I just took note of what he looked like and carried on towards my office. At first, the guy himself didn't alarm me. He was wearing the green and black striped shirts that our janitors normally wore with black pants. He also had a mop and bucket with him, so I just assumed he was one of the janitors working late. I go to my office, leaving my door cracked open, call my wife really quick to give her an update, and then started working. It wasn't too long after, maybe 30 to 45 minutes, when I start to hear something outside. It was talking. But it was just one voice, and the person sounded very angry. I couldn't quite make out everything that was being said, but there was a lot of sighing and F-bombs. I started getting a bad feeling, so I slowly got up and walked to my door. Listening from the doorway, I could hear the voice a bit more, and it definitely sounded like it was a one-sided argument. Like someone was practicing what they were going to say to someone else? If that makes sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though, and I didn't feel comfortable trying to leave, so instead, I quietly shut my door, locking it. I then closed the blinds in the narrow window by my door and turned off the light. I then went back to my desk and tried to continue working, but also kept getting distracted listening to the arguing. At one point, I stopped entirely as I could hear somebody dragging their feet near my office. I remember nearly holding my breath as I heard the doorknobs being jiggled and the sound of the card reader denying access. I didn't have panic attacks or anything of the like prior, but that's the only way I could think to describe how I was feeling. I was starting to feel overwhelmed, and I had this thought that I was in danger. But I just froze in place, hoping that the door lock and access machine would protect me. Shortly after, I heard what sounded like somebody kicking the door, shouting another expletive, and then walking off. I waited several more minutes before I finally came back to reality and contemplated my next steps. I thought calling the cops sounded like the smart thing to do, but even if I did, they wouldn't be able to get past the first set of doors without security buzzing them in, and there was no one on the security post due to the time. So I would have had to have left my office, unprotected, just to let them in. I decided to stay behind my locked door and called my wife again to let her know what just happened. I probably downplayed it a bit, not wanting to worry her. She told me that I should at least call my boss to let them know, and I agreed. I called my boss and had to leave them a message, and then I just waited to see if I could hear anything again. When it was seemingly silent, I opened my door and looked out again, not hearing or seeing anything. I took this opportunity, leaving all of my stuff except my wallet and phone in the room, quietly letting it lock behind me, and I ran as fast as I could out of the building. I even took the fire escape stairs to not be in the center of the building, in case that person was still there. I was able to leave and get home unscathed, but was still pretty freaked out. The next day, I went into work as normal, prepared to tell my boss about what happened. However, before I could even turn my computer back on in my office, my boss was at my door wanting to talk about the voicemail. I explained everything that happened, and I could tell by the look on his face that something was not right. He said that the janitors were only supposed to be there during normal business hours. So, he was immediately suspicious when I told them they were there. Unfortunately, their access cards would still let them in. But the problem was that they all knew that they should not be there. Other than the fact that they were there so late, the rest of the experience was definitely not okay. So, he had me go with him to security to review the tapes that night. What I saw seriously scared the hell out of me. I was hoping that I was just being paranoid, but knowing now what was behind that door made me realize that my feelings were warranted, which I think was worse. We watched the footage as the guy scanned himself in, bringing with him the mop and bucket that I saw. He walked around the 2 floors that he could get to, and then had stopped and was looking at and doing something on his phone where I saw him, so long that the lights had turned off. Shortly after, I walked in and saw the guy and then went to my office. And that's when the guy continued on going to each office door, trying his badge, and, of course, being denied access. Janitors were not allowed in the offices, unless accompanied by someone with access to that room due to confidential information. So he even stopped and tried my door. While the fact that he was trying all these doors was pretty unsettling itself, it's what he was carrying that made it more terrifying. This guy was holding a hammer in his other hand. He had left the mop and bucket in the hallway and just had this hammer and the badge. You tell me what he was planning on using that hammer for. As I stood there watching this, trying not to flip my lid in front of the boss, he asked me if I recognized the guy. I confirmed that he was the guy from last night, but I didn't know who he was. The problem was that the security guy watching the footage with us did not know the guy either, which was a problem. They see the janitors all the time and have had to help them with access to some rooms, so they were pretty familiar with them. This guy, he was not, though. So now, they had to go and review the access logs and see who was trying to get into these restricted rooms, which made things worse. My boss shared with me later that the guy who was there that night did not match the guy whose badge it belonged to. Like, it had been stolen. Even better. They ended up talking to the owner of the badge because he came in the next day, needing to be signed and let in, and he was in a panic, because he realized his badge was missing. And then he knew exactly what had happened to it. It was actually his roommate. Apparently he was kicking him out because he wasn't paying his part of the rent anymore. It was his home, he had just let his friend / the roommate move in, and he had also been stealing some of his belongings. So he told him that he had to go. That night, the guy went on a rampage, destroying things in the house while he was gone, and apparently stole his badge that he kept in his room. I guess that he thought he would be able to get in here, steal some things that he could sell or blackmail him for, maybe, but he didn't have access to anything like that, which made him mad. I, of course, just became a potential threat since I saw him. The guy whose badge was stolen was reprimanded pretty hard, but he didn't lose his job. He did come up and talk to me and apologized profusely for what happened, but I in no way had any ill will towards this guy. It's unfortunate that someone he called a friend would do that, but it's also not like he had the badge out in the open. He at least kept it in his room, so other than hiding it or locking it up, what else could he have done? He did help in tracking the guy down, though, and he was arrested, so at least we didn't have to worry about him again. That was still just one of the scariest things I have ever experienced, knowing my gut instincts could have absolutely saved me that night. So, to wrap this up, I'll just say to trust your instincts. Even if nothing happens, I think it's a hell of a lot better to be hyper-vigilant than to be in an I wish I would have done this situation. While I was going to school to become an RN, I took a job working the front desk at a local hospital. The job itself was pretty easy. I checked people in and out, took calls, directed them to different units, scheduled appointments. Pretty simple stuff. To be honest, the hardest part was probably dealing with the printer. Even better, I typically worked the graveyard shift. My classes started around 9, so I would get off in time to sleep a few hours, go to school, eat, and sleep some more, and then right back to work. So there was even less work to do overnights, unless it was a Friday or a Saturday. Those seemed to be the busiest nights. And no, I didn't have much of a social life at the time. I had plenty of friends. I just chose to get straight into schooling and work as much as I physically could to save up money. That way I could have more money and possibly free time whenever I landed my dream job. I guess I had goals, if anything. Anyways, So, this happened on one of those nights. The only person to have shown up had already been called back, so the waiting room was empty. The TV was on some kind of game show, and I was sitting at the desk working on my homework. The whole front of the building was a plain wall except for a small cutout that had a glass sliding door that led into another small square glassed area. Then, there was another set of doors that brought you into the building. So, if someone comes in straight from the front, I could see them enter both sets of doors. However, if someone were to come in from the side lot or walk up from the side, I may not see them enter the first set of doors. That's what happened with this lady. I had my face down in my textbook when I heard the whooshing sound of the doors opening. I looked up and saw a lady approaching the counter. Because of where I work, I do pay attention to how people look and try to understand the current state that they may be in. And with her, I noticed right away that something was not right. She was very thin and frail looking, but judging by her overall build, demeanor, and way of talking, she looked like she couldn't have been more than 40. She had on a huge jacket that she was nearly swimming in, which immediately alarmed me because we saw people dressed like that when they were trying to hide a wound, a weapon, and, for women, sometimes a very pregnant belly. Her hair was stringy and oily and pulled into a bun, and her face was sunken in with dark bags under her eyes. I asked her how I could help her, and what she was there for, and she said she actually didn't need a doctor, but she asked for my help specifically. She was talking a mile a minute, jumping around in her story, but what I got out of it was that her car broke down and she asked if I could come look at it. She said that she was trying to get to see her mom, who lived a few hours away, who had been at home dying of cancer, but that's why she ended up here. At first, I really did feel bad for her. I knew my fair share of friends and family that had had cancer, and I knew how scary that could be, so that immediately got my sympathy. However, I was not and never have been a car person. Even though I'm a guy and I guess people expect me to know these things, I can get my own gas and check fluids, but that's about it. So I told her that I wasn't really a car guy, and she said it was okay, but insisted that I just come to see if I might notice anything. I again explained that I couldn't be of any help and also said that I couldn't leave the building, since I was the only person working the front desk. She started to become more agitated and pushy on having me look at it, and as she pleaded, she started adding to her story, and it wasn't making sense. She kept saying that her kid was dying and needed to get home to her, but earlier, she had said it was her mom that was dying. I was catching all these discrepancies, and it was starting to make me feel more suspicious of the whole situation. So I tried to slow her down as I walked with her towards the door, hoping that this would also help. And I asked her what exactly was happening with her car. She, at first, wouldn't say more than it just wouldn't start. So I tried clarifying to see if it died while she was driving, or if she was trying to start it, did she get any lights, and so on. But no matter how much I tried, she would not give me any more information other than, I don't know, it won't start. Please, can you just come look at it? The more that I questioned her, the more flustered and agitated she became. Almost in tears that I wouldn't go out there, so I just stopped and asked her if she was okay. If maybe she was in some sort of trouble. Which is when she finally let go of my arm and stepped back, saying that she was fine. I told her that I would call a tow truck for her, as they could at least be more helpful than I was, and she screamed at me to not call anybody. I stood there, waiting to see what she would do next when she walked out angrily, saying, "Just never mind, I'll figure it out." I stood there to see where she would walk to and noticed that she walked to the side of the building where I could no longer see her. I thought it was weird, but then went back to my desk. However, the whole interaction was still eating at me, so I decided to ask one of the med techs in the back if they could watch the desk while I stepped outside for a quick break. They agreed. I wasn't lying about that part. I could not leave the desk unattended. They agreed, and once they came up, I walked outside and towards the side of the building, staying as close to the wall as I could. And that's when I saw the woman, and what I assumed to be her car, as well as some guy. They were seeming to be in a pretty heated argument by the way they were throwing their hands, and he was punching the car. I wasn't close enough to really hear what was being said, but the only thing I could make out was, "No, you go." Even worse, after a few more minutes of back and forth, they both got in the car, him in the driver's seat and her in the passenger seat, and then drove off, without a single issue. I went back into the building, pretty spooked at that point, and I told the guy watching the desk what had happened. He agreed that it was really suspicious, but since they left and didn't really do anything, said that ultimately there was nothing that we could do. I continued working that night, but that weird feeling kept on lingering. What was her end goal? What was her plan after I got outside? The fact that there was a guy out there with her and that the car started just fine freaked me out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I may have avoided a horrible situation. I'm curious if anyone else has heard similar stories like this. Could this have just been an attempted robbery? A kidnapping? I have no clue, but I try not to think about what could have happened anymore. Thankfully, I never saw them again, and I hope that no one else ever fell for their sinister scheme. So that, my friends, was a collection of some true scary night shift stories. Scary stories that happen on third shift, or overnight shift, or second shift. I'm not good with my shifts. I think third shift is the one that's like night to morning, right? These happened somewhere in the middle of there. Not necessarily third shift, but not just second shift. They happened in the evening hours in their shifts of work, so night shift. Okay, let's just go with that. It was just, they were night shift stories. They were good stories. Good creepy things that happened in the overnight shifts. I'm trying to think. I never really worked in the overnight shifts, other than, I think I've mentioned this before, the overnight shift where I worked at Blockbuster and had to do the inventory for them, that sucked. Other than that, I've always pretty much been a day shift worker, so I don't have any personal experiences, but yeah, definitely some good stuff. Anyways, friends, I hope you did enjoy the video. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. I would appreciate it. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing, as that helps tremendously. If you're feeling ever so bold, you can go down below the video and leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts, how you're doing. Let me know if you ever had a experience like these, or a night shift experience. If you have a full story, please send it my way at astheravendreams.com. That's the best way to do so. But yeah, hope you're all having a beautiful weekend. I hope I do see you again soon, but until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And don't forget it. And of course, until I see you again, my friends, much love, and sleep well.